Hello everyone, my name is Basilisk, and welcome to this vlog about one of my characters, Kura Wolf's Daughter. In this vlog, we're going to talk about how the character came about, how her domains connect to her character, how her powers expand on her character, her storyline, her connection to other characters, and we'll answer some questions some of the players had. So, let's get started, shall we? So, a lot of people assume that Kura was my project from the ground up. That isn't entirely true. Kura actually started existence as an NPC for another Mortalborn's quest, another Mortalborn player's quest. They were going to travel the world and gather a group of Mortalborn adventurers for, I think it was Vry. There were a few NPCs involved in this quest, and one of them was a larval version of Kura, with the domain she has now. I took an interest in the character, and the player who had proposed the NPC gave me the character to make into a PC, offered to give me the character to make into a PC, rather, which I pretty much promptly accepted. Now, this does mean that I didn't pick Kura's domains, but don't take that as a complaint. I actually really like her domains. Anyway, once I had the character, it was time to flesh her out. The original proposal for Kura was basically your typical wandering, quiet hunter type. Good enough for an NPC, don't get me wrong, but not exactly the most original character concept. As anyone who's read Kura's threads will have noticed, I took her in a very different direction from a quiet hunter. Making her a master politician who can be outright arrogant is something of a show-off and can be incredibly savage in a fight if push comes to shove. Now, sorry, I am working off script this time because there was a lot I wanted to get into this video, so sorry if I have to pause for a minute. It's because I'm scrolling the script down. Now, the politician angle came from wanting to do something different with Kura. She's the daughter of the immortal of the hunt, yeah, but she's the product of a very duty-bound culture, and she's the child of an immortal, a being she would have been raised to believe have the care of Idalos as their duty. Coming from that angle, a wandering hunter doesn't really make that much sense, does it? So instead, I figured that the best representation of that duty would be either military or politics. As I already had a soldier PC, and Kura wound up in politics. Making her a politician had an impact on her personality, of course. A good politician is controlled, calm, and given to planning, hence Kura's generally unflappable demeanor. And of course, a high-ranking politician is going to have gotten their hands dirty, which led to Kura being almost cold-blooded when it comes to dealing with political obstacles. She's no stranger to the darker side of politics, whether that be blackmail, espionage, coercion, or even outright assassinations if necessary. I'm generally very reluctant to call Kura an outright hero, and this is part of the reason why. She spent a long time in high-level politics, and it's made her quite ruthless when dealing with opposition. True, she'll play nice and fair as long as she can, but if that's no longer working, she'll employ other measures. Sorry, I keep looking down. I'm not actually used to looking straight at my mic. Even when I'm not working off a script, I tend to look at the video feed. It's a habit because I don't actually appear on camera very often. Anyways, as for her occasional arrogance and tendency to show off, she's over a century old and is a functional demigod. Of course she's got an ego and likes to be dramatic. This is helped by her being rather generally more deadly than people tend to give her credit for. As she's pointed out to at least one opponent, she and a few others went 7 to 104. That's 7 people, her and 6 other allies versus 104 enemies, roughly. She's with no friendly permanent deaths. Vega died, but she got right back to life. It's fine. And 103 of the opponents died. A large portion of which she dealt with herself, around 50 to 75 of them. Granted, she's aware that she didn't do that alone, but it doesn't make it any less effective as a taunt towards would-be opponents. Helps that she plays her secrets, including her semi-divine status, very close to the vest. I'd say you could ask Fugazi about how well her secret-keeping goes, but you can't. She kinda killed him when he underestimated her. But of course, there's those of you who probably remember the time she tore out a man's throat with her teeth. She may be a civilized politician, but Kura's still her mother's daughter, and has more than a bit of wild predator underneath that shell. That, when combined with her ruthless streak, means she's willing to do things that would shock her more mortal companions, simply because it's the most cost-effective way of dealing with the threat. You'd better believe she'll put both her fangs and her new talons that she got from a seasonal here recently to good use if the situation calls for it. However, another aspect of her nature that I haven't gotten to explore much yet is her feral side. Kura, like her little sister Ella, does have a feral side, but Kura's feral side is very poorly controlled when she gives into it. It's less animalistic and more monstrous, generally primarily concerned with killing whatever drove her to that state. There's a few hints of it throughout her threads, such as her tendency to be mildly irritated a lot of the time, and her 1,000 owl scream, but neither of those really show how much of a monster she could be if she was pushed far enough. Of course, no Mortalborn is complete without domains. I kept the ones from Kura's NPC write-up, archery, tracking, and owls. Now, here's a tip for those of you wanting to make a Mortalborn, but aren't quite sure how they're different from a regular PC besides the obvious, and that's the free powers. A Mortalborn's domains should be an integral part of the character, have an effect on their personality and actions outside of their powers, and we'll cover powers later on. So, you may be wondering how Kura's domains affect her personality and actions. Well, let's go down the list, shall we? First off is archery, and if you pay attention to her threads, Kura's got a very distinct approach to how she prefers to handle problems. She's very precise, dealing with them in the most efficient way she can, and operating on the idea that you should only ever have to deal with a problem once. She also tends to take time to think through a problem as best she can, and part of her taunting in a fight is because her opponents tend to be subconsciously drawn to respond to her taunting, giving her time to think things through. She also greatly prefers to deal with problems from something of a distance, and usually through indirect ways when she can. Granted, events on Scalvoris tend to move in such a way that she's forced to deal with things directly, to her continual frustration, but fortunately for her, she's just as capable of direct solutions as indirect solutions. Now, all of this mirrors how archery is performed. You can't just slash or hack away with a bow, unless you're playing Monster Hunter, but that's a different story. You have to make each shot count if you want to be effective. You also have to account for wind speed and direction, the drop-off from your arrow, so you have to plan each shot to make it effective. And finally, you'll want to be able to keep enemies at a distance, but be able to handle them if they get up close. Which is pretty much how Kura tends to deal with things. Now, as to the tracking domain, Kura is a very focused person. She tends to keep an eye on the goals she set out to achieve, and is constantly looking for ways to get there. She's also generally able to get at least a decent read on people, and can generally get a feel for what they're working for, and if it's a political goal, she can get it down pat if given enough time. But that's not actually part of the tracking domain, she's just good at her job. Admittedly, this domain is the least connected to her overall personality, as it's meant to reflect the gathering and observation of clues and signs to lead the tracker to prey, but it's the one I've explored the least so far. And finally, we have the Owl's domain. This domain is reflected in two ways. The first, of course, is her feral side. Owls are predatory birds that generally try to kill and eat what they attack. However, this is admittedly a very loose connection. The bigger connection takes a bit more in-depth explaining. For those who don't know, owls aren't strictly solitary birds and will form family groups or small flocks. However, even in these groups, they tend to hunt alone. Also, do keep in mind that I'm admittedly not a bird expert, so I could be wrong about this. This is just what my research has led me to believe, and it's what influenced the character. This is reflected in how Kura tends to work and interact with others. Kura has friends and family, but very few of either, relatively. She makes very close bonds with her few friends, her mother and her sister, but even then, she generally prefers to operate on her own a lot of the time. Again, events tend to lead her to working towards working in a group, and she's perfectly capable of doing so, but given a choice, she'll generally choose to fly solo unless there's a pressing reason for her to work in a team. Partially, this is intentional. She tends to find herself in dangerous situations and doesn't like to put others at risk. However, it's also part of her nature. Owls hunt on their own, and so does she when she can. Really quick before we get into the next section, I want to apologize if it seems like there's a bit of a gap between, a bit of missed footage in between sections. That's because I actually am recording, the different sections of my script. It's not all one block recording. I'm recording them each in a separate recording and then editing them all together. So that's why there's those little gaps. Anyways, of course, one of the key draws of playing a Mortalborn is their inherent powers. Mortalborn are the only way a PC can have powers unique to themselves from the very moment they're made. And yeah, I know capstones, but those are later. You can't start with a capstone. Anyway, the best powers have some narrative relationship to the Mortalborn themselves. Now, at the time of this recording, Kura has 4 Mortalborn powers: Deadeye and Multishot for archery, Unshakable Tracker for tracking, and Parliament of Owls for, well, owls. Now, unlike the domains themselves, the powers haven't affected Kura's personality much. Instead, it's the other way around. Her personality and journey are what gave birth to her powers. Now, we're actually going to go by how Kura got her powers chronologically in character. The first power she obtained was Parliament of Owls, and it's a power born of pure rage. If you read her other powers, Kura's raw power, before it forms into one of her abilities, usually manifests in a golden color. But the visual manifestation of Parliament of Owls is black. This is because of how she achieved the ability. See, when Kura was young, about 18, her father was blindsided by a bear and killed trying to save Kura's life. Kura didn't take this well, going completely feral and diving as deep into her own raw power as she could. The result corrupted part of her power, in a way. Kura keeps it very controlled, and that's because she's seen what happens when she doesn't. In a rage, Kura couldn't think of anything but death and destruction, and her power gave her a way to achieve that, reaching out and influencing every owl in the area it could reach. And she promptly used them to start tearing bloody chunks out of everything she could, not for food or as a goal, but out of sheer murderous rage. Granted, she did eventually learn to control Parliament of Owls, but that initial fury is always part of it, hence the black aura, and why her eyes start turning gold, which is part of the Parliament of Owls' visual appearance, whenever she starts to get irritated. The next power she got, was Unshakable Tracker when she was in her 30s. Kura started her political career in the legal system and was the judicator for a small town in the Eternal Empire at this time. Being a stubborn type, she tended to get more involved in investigations than she needed to, and eventually got involved in a rather messy kidnapping case. Blah. Eventually, her and the rest of the investigators lost the kidnapper's trail while he still had a victim with him. Kura would not accept that failure and kept trying to find the trail, unconsciously reaching into her power when into her own power to do it. Her powers reacted to her need, picking up on elements she hadn't consciously noted to create a trail for her to follow, a trail she could see. A power born of necessity, Unshakable Tracker is actually her least used power, usually because she doesn't actually need it that much, between her normal tracking skills and her Valderus powers. It's hot in here. The next power she unlocked was Deadeye, and Deadeye is a power she consciously tried to make. After unlocking Parliament of Owls through Rage and Unshakable Tracker through Need, Kura wanted more control over her first archery power, and set about trying to consciously develop an ability. Since the process was new to her, she decided to focus on a relatively simple ability, the ability to ignore the range limit on an arrow. Any type of arrow. It works from little pistol crossbows to longbows to ballistas. And so does her other archery power, by the by. Being new to the process of consciously trying to make things with her power, it took Kura nearly 2 arcs to finally pull it off, but she did manage to develop the Deadeye power. And then she hit a massive brick wall in her progress that she didn't even know about. See, Kura's mortal half is Severin, and the Severin are bonded with their spirit familiars. One isn't really whole without the other. Hiccups. The incompleteness prevented Kura from unlocking another new power until she was 124. A bit of a time gap there. Anyway, she found her 7th familiar after she decided to join the Scalvorous Council, and the two became one. This merging caused a surge in her power, and thus was the multi-shot power born. The reason why multi-shot functions the way it does, splitting one arrow into several, is because of the relationship between Severin and their familiars. It actually draws on her relationship with Ramit to make her 7th familiar as Ramit to make the arrow split. As to why it can split up into 11 different arrows, her powers amplify the split. Also, fun fact, the name of her 7th familiar, Ramit, is actually an anagram of Marith. Marith was Kura's father's surname, and the surname she uses to hide her status as a Mortalborn. Kura's storyline is a bit of a mess, unfortunately. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned that she had initially been conceived as an NPC for another player's storyline, and I initially had Kura participating in that storyline. Then the other player up and abandoned the storyline, leaving Kura dangling without much of a plot. She was also supposed to take part in the Battle for Tride's Tomb global event, but her starting thread got skipped over, sadly enough. I wound up letting her go quiet for a bit, then took her to Ron, where she acted as a mercenary for a time. She was supposed to join a sort of heroic mercenary group called the Paragons, but due to a number of outside factors, that wound up not happening either. So she went quiet again, until it came to light that Pegasus wanted the Scalvorus Council to have as many PCs on it as possible. Since Kura was always meant to get involved in politics in some level, I pretty much jumped at the chance and sent her to Scalvorus. This helped out her plots immensely. She's been involved in almost every major event that's happened in Scalvorus since she joined the council, and has been pretty active on the council as well. Of course, I do have plans for her going forward. I wanted to eventually become the head of the Scalvorus Council, after all. In truth, if the situation arises, I hope for her to eventually become the autocratic ruler of Scalvorus, but barring a major collapse of the council, that's a long way off. In more immediate terms, my plan for her is to set up an international alliance between Scalvorus and a couple of other territories, I'm already working on one of them, and work to improve the prison and legal systems of Scalvorus itself, although the legal system improvement won't be for a bit. You can only fit so much into one council meeting after all. Kura's connection to other characters are fairly varied. The connections are always based on how the story naturally develops between the characters after all, and each of those stories is different. For instance, Faith is Kura's best friend, and the two consider each other family. Because of this, Kura tends to act as a mixture of advisor, comforter, and troll for Faith whichever the situation calls for. She's also pretty close to Padrig as well, even supplying him with some of her own blood for his alchemical researches, and calling him to a council meeting because she trusted his knowledge and advice. There's also her relationship with some of the other Mortalborn she's met. Ella, for instance, is her little sister by a little over a century, and Kura tends to act as a combination of surrogate mother and big sister to Ella, being there when Ella needs her, but also being there to make her sister see sense. Lavanna Tharn is Rascalarn's daughter, and the two have had a rockier relationship. But Kura sees a great deal of potential in Lavanna. She's just not sure that Lavanna sees that same potential. Of course, she's got other friends as well, outside of Faith, Padrig, her sister, and Lavanna. Saphira is both her teacher and, in Kura's opinion, or teacher in magic when we finish that thread, and in Kura's opinion, the most trustworthy soldier on the island. She thinks Tio is a bit too hot-headed for his own good, but she likes him well enough. She gets along fairly well with Amaris, who she recruited to the council, and she even likes Maxine, although she's aware that Maxine is more than a bit of a troublemaker. Surprisingly, she doesn't actually have any player character enemies yet, but I'm sure one will come along sooner or later. Always does in politics. And, now it's time to answer some questions. So, yeah, we got a few. Leeson Andaris asks, when will Kura be buddies with Leeson? Actually, Kura's in Rarn in early Imoden. They can meet up then if you want. He also wants to know what her professional opinion on tortoises is. Well, Kura likes tortoises, actually. She's got a pet treadle, which is a tree-dwelling tortoise. She's also from the Eternal Empire, and they have giant tortoises called Ragdala that they use to transport things, so she thinks tortoises are pretty reliable. Now, from Ella, we've got 3 questions. Who is Kura's favorite sister? Ella, of course. She's only got the one, at least at time of recording. What do you listen to when writing Kura? I don't actually have a specific song or type of music I listen to when writing anyone, honestly. I listen to whatever I was listening to at the time anyways, which varies on a near weekly basis. What's my favorite Kura thread? That one's tough. I've done some really good threads with her. Fractured Family was heartbreaking, but fun to write. The Darkest Shadow Can Be Found showed how effective she can be in a fight pretty well. The Longest Night in Silence was a fun little political thread. Honestly, I don't have a particular favorite, just threads I think are really good. She has a lot of quiet threads. She hasn't had any big moments yet, but we'll get there. Then, from Aegis, we've got 4 questions. I've heard you mention she used to be an assassin. As such, who hired her? Rascalarn herself? Yeah, actually. Hiccups. Kura wasn't an assassin for hire or anything of that nature. Rascalarn would have her do assassination missions as she got older and more adept with her powers, since they gave her an edge that made her ideal for some situations. Who was she assassinating, when, and where? Usually people who were trying to mount an insurrection or a rebellion, black market dealers, situations where the military could be sent in, but it would be very messy, cause a lot more needless death. So instead, Kura was sent in, making use of her powers to deal with things quietly and efficiently, and almost always in or close to the Eternal Empire with this sort of mission. She never ventured very far out of its bounds. How did she commit the assassinations? Almost always an arrow with the Deadeye skill. Or she'd use Unshakable Tracker and wait for an opportune moment if using Deadeye wasn't great. wasn't the best solution. She's not a poisoner or a brawler. She's functionally a sniper who happens to be handy at close-range archery. Sorry. She'd use Parliament of Owls for cleanup, though, if she needed to make someone disappear completely. You know, kill them and then tear up and divvy up the body. What effect did her assassinations have on the history and politics of the land? Generally, if she was called in to assassinate someone, it was to keep things going on course. Kura would only ever resort to killing a political rival if they made the first move on that front. People trying to cause a rebellion, or black arms dealers trying to sell plague-bearer poisons and the like, those she'll take out on orders. Think Mission Impossible, kind of, in terms of what kind of things she does, except Kura's quieter than Tom Cruise is. I should hope anyway. Well, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this vlog. I'll probably do more like this in the future, but I'm not sure when. In the meantime, I'll see you in the next video. Thank you, and good night, folks.